The Dogma Podcast. Where my dog's at? Let's go!
Hi, Jasmine.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hold on, I can't hear you. You might be on mute. Are you on mute?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, now I can hear you. There you go.
Okay. Hi. Hey, today we have with us attorney Jasmin Mize. Jasmine is a DC area civil rights and criminal defense attorney. She currently is an associate professor of CUNY Law, teaching subjects of criminal law, criminal procedure, and civil rights litigation. Most recently, Jasmine handled class action cases as a senior supervising attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Her accomplishments are many. Additionally, Jasmine has spent 8 years as a public defender on the state and federal levels. Her personal page will be listed below if anybody wants to know more about her. Welcome, Jasmine.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I am very grateful for that very nice, warm welcome. And appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Your accolades are so many. We'd have been talking for 10 minutes.
Oh, that's very kind. That's very kind.
You're very accomplished. Thank you for being on the show.
Absolutely.
Today, the title of today's show, as you know, is Racial Disparity in the Federal Criminal Sentences. And that's something that's dear to my heart, being an ex-convict myself.
Right.
And I just feel that the climate now is where we need to address, actually look for resolutions and things like this, because there's a great disparity in the sentencings. I think the whole judicial process between how Blacks and whites are treated. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely do. As you mentioned, I was a public defender on both the state and the federal level for the beginning of my career. And there's nothing like feeling and receiving and understanding the power of the government in the criminal justice system. It's immense, it's overwhelming, it has an intensity that I think many people don't know unless you've been standing there,
Sure.
And so I would absolutely agree. The manner in which and the policies that are implemented have certainly brought us to a very dark place, I would say. And that's why a lot of people don't even like to refer to the criminal justice system as that. They say criminal legal system, because as we'll get into, I know through your questions here, there are so many discretionary points in the system that impact vulnerable communities, people of color, in intentional ways. And we only really see some of the sort of results, the conclusory kind of events. But there's so many things that happen along the timeline that are problematic and are worthy of discussing and reform.
You mean the whole process itself? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Just not the specifics of a disparity, but the whole, and I don't want to say systemic, but that's what you're kind of implying, process in and of itself.
Absolutely. So, lots of folks land in court, and that starts a particular process that we think of as sort of an adjudicatory process, right? The judge and the prosecutor kind of play these roles and kind of bringing about a resolution to a criminal charge. But there's so many things that happen before somebody lands in court that have to do with the decisions of law enforcement that are also, it's like peanut butter and jelly. And I'm so sorry for my dog there. So, I think of the criminal process as sort of having two parts. The back part is the adjudicatory process where you're in court, and the end event is the sentencing, the conclusion of a criminal case. But the beginning half, in my view, is the investigatory or the law enforcement piece of it that bears examination as well. So it's peanut butter and jelly. It's two parts to the same system, and they both kind of work together to kind of be, you know, the systemic issues that we're talking about.
We have a couple of fun facts here. We're just going to use these for background. Black men constitute 6% of the US adult population, but approximately 35% of the prison population, and are incarcerated at a rate 6 times that of white males. This is from a 2012 report. I don't know how much that is de-escalated or increased, but you can see the disparity and just in the sheer numbers. Another fact is Blacks receive sentences that are almost 10% longer than those of whites arrested for the same crimes.
Yep.
So this is just a little snapshots of what you're saying, that there's a big problem. And I think I'm going to have to touch, this is going to get a little sensitive here toward the end, because we're going to have to talk about the real root causes of where this comes from. Because I do believe that in order for there to ever be any kind of resolution, I don't know if there'll ever be an ultimate resolution, but because of the depth of what perpetrates all this stuff, but to begin with, there has to be some honesty and some accountability. And I think that the only way that can ever happen is if individuals admit to what is the truth. I mean, okay, it is what it is, but how do we positively move forward? So that's actually the platform for this conversation is, you know, I'm here and hopefully you're here to talk about the problem, but perhaps look for some resolution and see what we can even get other people's, you know, wheels to thinking and, you know, kind of, you know, hold on to these truths and maybe take it and say, okay, maybe we do need to do something and take a look at it. To reinforce what we're talking about now, I have these video clips that I put together, and we're going to kind of break them down a little bit, and you tell me what you think.
Okay.
Major developments in the prosecution of those rioters involved in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Tonight, a judge has issued the longest sentence yet. This went to a former New York City police officer who assaulted another police officer. More than a year and a half after the Capitol riot, nearly 250 people have been sentenced for their roles in the insurrection. But former NYPD officer Thomas Webster, seen here holding a flagpole, will now serve 10 years behind bars for injuring a D.C. officer.
Everybody, we're going to begin with a news alert out of Washington tonight. A D.C. judge told a Largo man that you made a big mistake and then sentenced him to the longest prison time yet for the January 6th Capitol riot. More than 5 years. Robert Palmer is now headed to prison.
Jacob Chansley, the self-proclaimed QAnon shaman, has just been sentenced to 41 months in prison for his role in the January 6th Capitol riots. He was seen entering the Senate chamber with a spear. Prosecutors say he led a group of rioters in a prayer at the dais and left a threatening note to former Vice President Mike Pence. Chansley pled guilty to 1 count of unlawfully obstructing an official proceeding, a felony.
We're going to go down and storm the Capitol.
USA!
We're all going to be up here, and we're going to be breaking those windows.
This was Jenna Ryan 1 year ago.
No, you cannot take our country!
A real estate broker in Dallas, she was invited to ride on a private jet to D.C.
If it comes down to war, guess what? I'm going to be there.
When Cynthia McFadden first interviewed Ryan for Today last January, she had just been arrested.
The FBI raided my house and took my phone, my computer, and my MAGA hat.
Months later, she pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor for illegally entering the Capitol. Her lawyers were asking for probation, but she continued to post on social media.
You wrote, "Sorry, I have blonde hair, white skin, a great job, a great future, and I'm not going to jail. Sorry, haters."
I know we want to go right to that one, but let's break these down a little bit.
Sure.
Because these really, to me, really reinforce what we're talking about here. The first one, the news clip is talking about the NYPD police officer, right, who was sentenced to 10 years. And according to all the things that we've researched, he's got about the longest sentence for assaulting another police officer. Now, we want to think that if we could change the script a little bit and had this been a Black man that had committed the same crime, would it have been something as, in my mind, light as 10 years for a similar offense? I'm asking you, what are the guidelines for this type of attack on a policeman? You know, you've probably prosecuted people that have attacked a policeman, whether it's on the federal or state level. Is 10 years for something like this, stormtrooping the Capitol and actually physically attacking, and it hurt the man, is the report. Is that a fair sentence, do you think?
Well,
Not
that's
a fair sentence, but do you think it would be the same if it were a Black man?
well, that's a great question because the answer is really complex. So first off, I would say that kind of and I apologize if this is a little long-winded, but I think it's all important to kind of really get at the issues here, which is these are cases that were brought in federal court. And you know, by and large, we focus on federal sentencing laws because they tend to sort of be instructive in terms of how state sentencing regimes are crafted and implemented. So while there are 50 states, there's the District of Columbia and then the federal court system. I like to say to my students, there are actually 52 criminal justice systems across the country. The federal court system, particularly with respect to criminal charging, trials, and then sentencing, the way in which Congress legislates all the procedures and then the sentencing regimes are often mirrored in state systems. However, what the federal system has, in a sense, pretty uniquely, is this sort of governance over particular crimes that state systems don't necessarily have corollaries or sort of similar offenses. So for the January 6th events, there was, for most prosecutions in those cases, a charge of sedition, which is only a federal law charged in federal courts, and you know, various judges have opinions about how to implement it. And then most of the marquee charge that most of those defendants were charged with was an obstruction of justice offense, which in some instances can be charged as a misdemeanor offense, and on the state level is often charged as a misdemeanor.
It was actually in one of these cases, it was charged as a misdemeanor.
It's charged as a misdemeanor. And then some criminal conspiracy offenses in the federal court system are also misdemeanor offenses. So not really knowing specifically what all the indictments look like, I would say that, you know, a lot of these prosecutions, particularly those against law enforcement and particularly those that got a lot of attention, were like political statements. And I think judges were in positions where they used their pulpit in a way to try to message that I'm going to try to give the most heavy-handed sentence here in order to send the message about how uneven the system is in general. And I think they thought they were doing that. However, your question.
Wait a minute. They thought they were doing what? Break that down again.
So, you know, in the federal system with the federal sentencing guidelines, the way the sentences are crafted are generally premised on two things. One is, what is the criminal history of the offender? You know, if you've got no criminal history, you're in this bracket that kind of places you within a range that is typically lower than someone who's got, say, a burglary or a low-level drug crime on their record, and then they're facing this serious offense in federal court. They're, you know, triple and quadruple punished for their prior crimes and their prior contacts with the criminal justice system because of their prior record. And so you kind of look at, there's this rubric or this chart that basically places your criminal history into 7 categories, 7 being the highest, 0 being the lowest. So if you've never had any prior contacts with the criminal justice system, you're generally looking at a suggested sentencing range that's much lower than someone that's had multiple contacts with the criminal justice system. And this is kind of where my analysis of your question kind of brings to bear what I said initially, which is policing and law enforcement and charging decisions are super important about what we see as far as end results are concerned. There's not a controversial statement that's to say, as you started with some of the statistics, that Black men make up the highest demographic within the criminal justice system. And most entry points that are often seen are as a juvenile offender, if you actually really start pulling apart and digging at, like, what do the statistics say? So when you ask the question, would a Black male have received the same sentence as that ex-cop from NYPD?
For all of those reasons you just stated, it's obviously no.
Right, obviously no, because most likely statistically, you'd probably be looking at someone who has a prior criminal history, which would then elevate the range that the sentencing judge is looking at. And it's become kind of this very sort of sterile mathematical question that judges kind of just say, well, the suggested sentencing range is between 36 and 48 months based on the data, the prior criminal history, and then the factors that are relevant to the charging itself in this particular case. And so while judges have to look at this prior criminal history, it starts to inform what the suggested sentencing range is. The judges have discretion to depart is the language. They can depart downward or upward from the sentencing range.
But they
by and large,
very seldom don't, though.
Right, within 90% of sentences fall within the suggested guidelines range, and that's because judges want to kind of go with this idea of uniformity. They want to give uniform sentences with respect to or similarly related offenders, and then charges that are broad, or, you know, sort of, if you're charged with these offenses, if your indictment looks like this, you're going to get a similar sentence than someone who's similarly charged.
But Jasmine, let me interrupt you for a second before I lose my train of thought. So if the guidelines, I guess, I don't know the terminology for all of this sentencing I guess guidelines is,
yeah. So
if they are what you say they are, the less of a prior you have, the lesser time you're going to get, and that's the fairness, the equity, and the whole thing. But yet and still, you've said that most Blacks already have some kind of criminal background from teenager. Then that means that a Black is, in theory, set up for failure. But couldn't someone say that if you stayed out of trouble, you wouldn't fall in that bracket in the first place?
And they could say that, right? And a lot of times prosecutors do say that, you know, they'll say this is about, you know, folks being accountable for their history. You know, if you've been in trouble once before, the judge and the sentencing judge has got some right to know about it, because that's what we want to consider when we think about the purposes behind punishment, one of which is deterrence, right? One of the theories behind punishment is we want to deter folks from doing
rehabilitate.
And rehabilitation is another purpose of punishment, but it's often kind of put in the shadows. It's often about incapacitation and deterrence and sending a message. And so if someone's been in trouble before, it's kind of like, you got a second chance, you shouldn't get another second chance. And so judges and prosecutors in particular tend to think of things in terms of like, if you've got a history, that's going to work against you. And that makes rational kind of good sense when you think about whether or not we've got a reason to punish you in the first place. And so when I bring about the statistics about folks like the likelihood of having a criminal history, that's going to bear on what the sentencing judge is going to be thinking about and what they're confined to when they actually look at the guidelines and they hear the arguments from the government and they say, hey, this is what I think I'm going to impose in this case. And for good or for bad, and I would say for bad, we have come to this place within the federal court system, and because the states follow the feds, it's just like sort of inspirational, right? If the feds do something, if Congress legislates something, state legislatures kind of do the same when it comes to criminal justice. So while we have a federal sentencing regime, most states have the exact same thing going on. They just kind of call it by a different name. The federal courts use this.
So just for clarity, I'm sorry, but just for clarity, so whatever the feds, because we know the feds are a little bit more punitive.
Right.
So whatever the feds determine, the states kind of adopt that.
Yes, sort of like as a lock and step. You know, constitutional scholars will say there's this bit in the 10th Amendment that basically says Congress has the right to legislate things that have to do with the nation, taxation and commerce and things like that. Police power is left to the states. So the states can kind of have this free range fiefdom, 51 jurisdictions across the country that can do whatever they want, but they look to Congress for guidance. And because we have a federal court system that resolves federal crimes, and we have Congress that has legislated as a matter of policy this idea that sentencing should fit these goals, most states fall in line and kind of imitate and adopt, exactly like you say, the federal sentencing guidelines, sort of the language of it and the regime of it. And by regime, I mean, there are literally worksheets that the prosecutors, the probation offices, and then the courts look at before they impose a sentence. They look at criminal history, and then they look at this very complex scheme of points that are assessed regarding the crime alleged. So crimes of violence have higher points. You know, if you committed a white collar crime is what they call it, a fraud crime, you defrauded somebody, there's major money loss. They look at the amount of loss, how much money was stolen, how much was defrauded in these big mortgage cases, things like that. And so the more egregious or offensive the crime sounds, the higher the points that are assessed against the defendant for the crime they actually did. Then you look at the prior criminal history, you put together, it's literally a math equation. that gets computed by probation officers and pre-sentencing officers. The prosecution gets it, the judge takes a look at it, and then if you're playing defense, what you've got at your disposal is basically saying, this is just, kind of this sterile numbers game. This shouldn't be a numbers game. This is a person. And judge, you've got to see this person as unique, and you got to take into account the uniqueness and the separate all of the kind of statistics and make a sentence that's just and fair. And that's where you're left.
All the other variables, because there's a lot of other variables other than a rap sheet.
Right, exactly. And there's a law that's 18 USC 3553 is the citation. There's all these factors. There's about 15 of them that the judge is supposed to consult, the personal and characteristics and history of the defendant, kind of tapping into the narrative, the personal narrative. But the reality is I played defense in court for all those years. And judges look at those worksheets, they look at the numbers, they look at the range. Okay, 36 to 48 months. 98% of my colleagues never deviate. So I'm just going to go with the formula, and I'm not going to listen to the arguments made by the defendant. And that's why when you ask the question, and I'm sorry to get so technical, but it is a technical
go
game.
ahead.
It's sadly a very technical game. And advocates, criminal defense attorneys, the best of them, the most talented of them, try to find a way. They go into court and they try to find a way to take the numbers game out of the conversation and say, this is a person, and let's look at this rationally. Let's look at this objectively. Let's take the sensational statistical game out of the conversation and actually have a conversation about a human being. But it's tough to do. It's actually really tough to do. And so when you ask the question, like, would a Black person have received the same sentence as that police officer in the January 6th case? It's a tough one to answer because, Black people are treated differently by the system. And January 6th in and of itself was this unique thing where some judges want to make a statement about how terrible and egregious the conduct really actually was.
Well, wait a minute. What kind of statement were they making? All of these people got light sentences. If you ask me, the last young lady, this Jenna Ryan, she got 60 days.
Right. So that's a super light sentence. But what was probably relevant
that's an understatement.
Right. I mean,
yeah.
and that's kind of me being a little bit sarcastic, right? But then, there were judges that said, I'm going to give as much as I can possibly give, being constrained by this idea that there are these sentencing guidelines. And I'm usually not one to go outside the guidelines. And so I'm not going to go outside the guidelines to even make a positive point, which is.
So wait. So are you saying that these people were actually sentenced according to the guidelines that you're describing, and that's why they got light sentences? Because the police officer may not have had a prior record.
Yep.
So it was mitigated to the nth power by him going to stormtrooping the White House. Come on now, let's be real. Stormtroop in a riotous way, right? This is actually insurrection.
I mean, some of it was homicide. They killed a couple people. I mean,
exactly.
To commit homicide.
When I looked up the word treason, this was a classic treason when you have disloyalty to an allegiance to a land or a country that you should have allegiance to. That's what that was. They had lack of allegiance. They were going to, you heard what she said. You can't take my country or our country, whoever their country is. But so then that explains this then, if people are really listening, because these people didn't get any time. This QAnon shaman, the Yellowstone Wolf, he calls himself, marches in there with no shirt on, a wolf's headpiece, a spear with the American flag wrapped around it, half naked, gets up on one of the politicians' desks and writes a nasty note to the vice president. Right. If you'll notice, if we were to run that clip back, you would actually see that the police are like peacefully walking behind this guy. There's a police officer behind him when he goes into the chambers. What I'm trying to say is, so in spite of all of that, because he was convicted of obstructing a congressional proceeding and sentenced to 41 months, which is 3.5 years. There's people that have had an ounce of weed or cocaine and be a 3-time offender and have got that much time.
Oh yeah.
So what's going on here? This is all about just sentencing guidelines geared toward people that get into trouble?
I would say that's part of it. So I want to say one thing about what I think of, how we kind of make sense of these light sentences. I think, we're looking at the woman who got the 60-day sentence for
60 days.
50 days. She most likely, will make an assumption, didn't have a criminal record, and that was based on her privilege, right? And probably the way she's lived her life and where she's lived her life and what she's been able to get away with, like a lot of folks do in certain places and spaces. And so lacking a criminal history and the way in which the prosecutors may have chosen to charge her kind of go the conservative route as opposed to the heavy-handed route, and they probably charged her lightly with the misdemeanor offense. Most misdemeanors under federal criminal statutes, under the federal code, call for a jail sentence of no greater than 6 months. So if you're charged with a misdemeanor in federal court, a DUI, an obstruction, a conspiracy, you're looking at, by law, getting no greater than 6 months as a legal sentence. And then you're looking at a judge who's also then looking at the guidelines and saying, what's the recommended
But
sentence?
wait, Jasmine, wait. So the guidelines are dictate and even supersede the seriousness of whatever the crime is that you commit. Is that what you're saying? Because that's what you're saying. Because to me, stormtrooping,
Here's
and
what
how can that be?
So let me, I also apologize for the lengthiness and complexity of this answer, but it's very important for why I'm saying what I'm saying, which is we got to the sentencing guidelines through a very long journey that started kind of in the mid 80s, right? In the wave of what folks would say kind of became the real draconian legislature of the 1994 crime bill was predated by this movement within criminal justice system to create higher punishments, mandatory minimums, punish people who had involvement or any kind of involvement, low level, high level, whatever you call it, with controlled substances. And we had
is this during the 80s when there was a big epidemic of the drug infusion here in the United States?
Right. And so basically what folks,
so that was part of their way of dealing with that then?
It was. And what was the relation point is that before we had the sentencing guidelines, we had this thing called indeterminate sentencing, which is you had the law that says you can get from 0 to 6 months for a misdemeanor. And the judge you go into court and the judge can give you whatever the judge thinks, can give you 0 days, 120 days based on what the judge thought was relevant with respect to imposition of sentence. You go to a prison facility and you might be able to get out, on parole because you were achieving certain goals in custody, right? And so judges were imposing sentences. You would hear, systems that still have parole. You get 10 years, but someone might get out in 2. This idea that you get this punishment, but you might be able to be released early based on how you would, certain benchmarks you meet in prison. Then, we got to a place in our culture where there were increases in crime. There were increases of violence and there were an uptick in terms of policing in terms of like drugs and guns and things like that. And so laws started to change, punishments started to get more severe, and then folks would start to harp on law and order. People would start to harp on this idea. Someone got out of prison, they were supposed to get 20 years, but they only actually served 3. And that started to sour with respect to public opinion. And so then Congress and states that followed started saying, look, we're going to now start doing this thing where we're going to create guidelines. We need to have more uniformity in sentences. And we also have to have what's called truth in sentencing. If you get 8 years, you serve 8.
This didn't happen before then.
It did.
This wasn't the case. And when was that again? During that time when they started?
Kind of the movement started mid-80s.
These guidelines?
The guidelines are a creature of about the mid-90s. So the guidelines were put before Congress in the mid-90s. But
they're a result of the 80s.
Right. They're a result of previous years, kind of like this law and order energy that really started with, the Reagan years, punishing the poor, punishing drug users, not just possessors and sellers, but, this energy afoot that was, we're going to punish marginalized communities for involvement with drugs and guns, and we're gonna make a pariah out of those communities, and we're gonna impose these really heavy punishments for that kind of conduct, whether it's good or bad or ugly. It doesn't matter. We're just gonna do it.
Was that a conspiracy? Is this a conspiracy I'm hearing? I don't want to be classified as conspiracy theorist, but
it's working as
what do you
designed.
think?
I'll say that it's working as designed.
Okay, touche.
You know, it's working as designed. And I would say, you know, people started having a major problem with this idea that you could get 20 years from a judge for something that's terrible. And then you get out in 3, and then we got a problem. We got criminals walking the streets. That's a problem. We can't do that. So we need to change the sentencing schemes. What we need to do is have judges we need to have judges constrained to this idea that the law says you can get up to 20 years, but we're going to have recommendations. You got to stay within these benchmarks, these guidelines, and then Congress legislated guidelines. At first, they were mandatory, and you had to give a sentencing within the guidelines. Then, through some advocacy on the defense side, we basically said, that's not fair. They're just advisory. You have to look at them, advise, and then say you can go one way or you can go left, right, or in between. We don't, it just, as long as it's whatever is prescribed by the law, you can't give over the amount listed in the statute. And so when we went from a mandatory to an advisory structure, and now judges are in this mess where it's like, they're in this place where all the world expects me to go within the guidelines, and I can't depart. I can't go away from them. So if the guidelines for this woman is probation because she stormed the Capitol, I'm really hard pressed to make a decision that's outside the bounds of what I'm being told I should do. So I'm going to give her a guideline sentence. And basically what we have is the statistics start lining up with what, as again, the system working the way it's designed, which is we're going to punish certain people a certain way. And we got the math equations to prove it. And all my colleagues in the courthouse are doing the same thing. Why would I be a radical? Why would I be a renegade? Why would I give an outside the bounds sentence? Why would I do that? 98% of the time, I go in the guidelines.
You're talking about the judge or the prosecutor?
The judges, they have the ultimate say, right? Prosecutors, I will say this, I've worked on the state level, I worked on the federal level. Federal prosecutors, you know, I'm not here to paint them with a broad brush, but you know, they have told me, you know, in the hallways of the courthouse, you know, about how they make decisions about charging. They'll tell me, they'll say, look, I'm not bringing a case unless I'm going to win. I know I'm 100% sure I got the evidence. I'm not going to bring a case that I know I can't prove any old day of the week. So the detectives have done all the work for me. The FBI agents have done all the work for me. I'm just going to go to court and tell the court, I rest on my papers. I've written what I think is relevant. I'm not going to say anything. You do the work for me, judge. Prosecutors, you know, you think about the criminal justice system as this triangle. You got defense, you got the judge, you got the prosecutor, and you want to think of it as this like very even triangle. But we all know that it's this outsized thing where prosecutors and judges have this like immense amount of power, and you've got this very thin, you know, sort of point where defense attorneys, like I said, are challenged when it comes down to sentencing. Like, what do you say to humanize this person and take the numbers game out of the equation? It's very difficult to do because we have moved along this path over the last 40 years where we've whittled it down to a math equation. We literally have whittled it down to a math equation when it comes down to going into court, and the judges and the prosecutors know it, and it works at their advantage to do less work.
But even if you could humanize the person and so that you can mitigate the sentencing, wouldn't the guidelines still prohibit the judge or the prosecutor from doing that?
Oftentimes it's like an unspoken prohibition. You can do whatever you want as a federal judge. You know, I have had cases where I've literally said that to the judge. You don't have to give a year and a half. You don't have to give 18 months to this young guy who literally, you know, to simplify it, made a mistake. You don't have to do that. You could give him half of that. You could give him a quarter of that. You can. It's legal. It's not illegal to do it. You're confined by this idea that the sentencing guidelines, you know, are, if you go outside, it's like doing something so radical that you're going to get scrutiny for it. And judges do feel that. And what's dangerous, I think, because I was mentioning this kind of back where we started, that the state systems follow the federal system. Federal judges are appointed by the president. Under Article 3 of the Constitution, the president appoints every single federal court judge. And in DC, we're not a state. So DC Superior Court is the local court in DC, but those judges are appointed by the president. They don't have to worry about election. They don't have to worry about constituents. They can do what they want to do. They have a job for life. State judges are different. They are elected. And so when you think of the sentencing guidelines, the same way you think about federal court, and then you go into a courtroom just across the river in Virginia, those judges are elected by the people. and they want a job after every 6-year term. And if they start doing things that the people don't like, they're going to lose their job. And you have to think about that, because that is what informs a lot of their decisions. They don't want, violent criminals running the streets. They got to be tough on crime. They get too tough on crime, then they get attacked. Then they gotta lighten up, or whatever it is that they think they got to do in order to win their job again. I come from a place, I'm a DC native. I was here on January 6th. I don't got no problem with a tough sentence being issued. That's the one and only time I'd say I got no problem with the tough sentence for those offenders. I was here. I live a mile from the Capitol. And it was nothing but chaos. And it was
did you go over there?
Oh, no. Everybody who knew better stayed in the house.
Okay.
Everybody who knew better knew to stay away. And that's just a personal point there. But, those judges that are sitting and presiding over those prosecutions, those are the judges that are appointed by the president. And so, in my opinion, they've got carte blanche to do what they think is right in their gut, not what the sentencing guidelines say, not what the prosecutors say to do, not what the defense attorneys say to do, but what they think is right.
So wait, because this is very important. So by law, they can actually step outside of the guidelines.
Yes.
Because the guidelines are just guidelines. They're not electric fences that you can't cross. They're just guidelines. So they can go either way outside the guidelines if they choose to?
Right. So initially, when the guidelines were crafted, they were mandatory. And then there was a case in late 90s called Apprende v. New Jersey. And the defense there was basically, starting this wave of analysis about how problematic the guidelines were, because they say there's a delta between what the guidelines say and what the statute says is a maximum. And in order to go in between the two of those two things, you got to have due process of law. You got to make the government prove all the reasons why you're going to get this enhanced sentencing. And so there was a revolution within the revolution of the guidelines that basically landed us at this place where the guidelines are advisory only. The judges must advise them. It's basically like, you got to look at it. Okay, these are the guidelines. I put on the record, the guidelines are 36 to 48 months. I'm going to sentence in the guidelines, or I'm going to depart downward, or I'm going to depart upward. And the court has to put it on the record, whether they're going inside or outside the guidelines, but they are not mandatory.
So that means that we're getting these sentences, me being the Black man, that they're telling us they need to stay inside of some guidelines, when actually they have the discretion to step outside of the guidelines either way.
Absolutely.
True. That is so unfair. I have this question that, and it's kind of a hard question. Is the perception among, and I'm asking you this as a white woman, is the perception somehow that Blacks, and I think in large part it would be because of the history of this country, we came in as property, but we're not property anymore. So is that perception from the history of this country carried forth to that whites somehow in their hearts just really believe that Blacks are not as entitled to the equities in this country as they are, the delicacies in this country, like, great education, great housing, being able to be in a position to get the wealth that whites do get. I mean, I know that people say that Blacks have the same opportunities. I debated that one time with a scholar years ago. I wasn't really prepared for that, but I was so passionate about it. But we don't have the same chances. And you know that, I believe, because as a white woman, you're putting yourself in a little, I don't want to use the word awkward, but unorthodox, let's use that word, position to champion almost these causes. So I'm asking you, do you feel is the really the white perception, because you're around them, whether it's work or in your personal life, do white people just feel like basically that we're not entitled to the same things that they're entitled to?
Well, I mean, I definitely know that some white people do. And those are some white people in positions of power, unfortunately. Many white people in positions of power may feel exactly as you just described, that they don't feel that Black people are entitled to the same rights. And as you mentioned the word delicacy, sort of like these nuances in society. And that's a well-established belief since the beginnings of this country, and they exist very well today. I think January 6th pointed that out, you know. And there are some white people that do feel that. And then some white people, you know, to sort of thinking for whatever reason of like MLK and the letter from Birmingham jail, like these well-intentioned white people recognize that there are problems with the way some white people view power and try to do something to kind of sometimes address their implicit bias, equalize society. And, you know, you want to think of those as positive efforts. And then you have others that, you know, are trying to do their best to be allies because they recognize the inherent problems. I like to think of myself as that last category. I also want to add, as again, I mentioned, I was born and raised in DC. I'm the child of immigrants. And I grew up in a city where the mayor's an African-American male, the city council is majority African-American, the majority of the police force is African-American.
Something similar to Atlanta, yeah.
Similar to Atlanta. I recently lived there as well. Similar there. And I, you know, growing up, going to public school, going to even parochial schools, most of my classmates were Black. You know, kind of trying, you know, growing up, understanding, you know, their experience and trying to figure out what it means to be like an ally, to be in, you know, in community, in society, in a place where I have privileges that they don't, and figuring out what that means. Like, what does that mean for me? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? And it's a challenge. And some white folks, you know, like I said, are the total end of the spectrum, which is they don't believe in equal powers to persons of color, to African Americans in particular, and they are unfortunately in positions of power. You know, DC is an interesting place to kind of grow up and see that, because there's an interplay between all those different kinds of people. And, you know, I think we're having a great conversation, a more open conversation now, as opposed to some years ago, about what it means to kind of check your privilege and understand that a little bit deeper and do things differently. It just means different things for different people. You know, when I think about the criminal justice system and the work I've done, you know, I tend to think of things as like, it's problematic on so many levels, and the discretionary points are where we have all the problems. It's not just the courts, it's the police, it's the probation officers, it's the local government that doesn't understand, you know, the needs, particularly when it comes to policing. You know, it's like everybody's at a disadvantage of information or something along those lines. So it's difficult to say, but unfortunately, you know, you do have a situation where you got most federally appointed judges are white males. I mean, we just got the first Black woman on the Supreme Court. You look at federal courts of appeals, it's majority white males. You look at every district court judge in federal court system, mostly white males. Some persons of color, some women, not a lot, majority white males. I worked across the river in Northern Virginia for 1.5 years in the federal court system. I think with the exception of one woman, it is all white males that preside over a spectrum of cases, mostly involving immigrant people.
But let me ask you that for a moment, because I this is all that you're saying now goes really back, it's rooted in what you said initially. And this is one of the things that I really advocate for. You state that I think based on your proximity growing up and being around Black people, helps you to understand Black people in a way that most whites don't. And a lot of whites, especially suburbanites, get their information. If you work with a few Blacks, you know, everybody has the work face on. So that's not the same intimacy as, you know, you being in school and you're a youngster and you guys are developing and, you know, you're watching how Black people interact and you're interacting as a youth in that, you know, in that situation, in your workforce, when you're driving, and the people that are protecting you or whatever they're doing are Black policemen and things like that, and people in the legislature. when you have that kind of experience, I think it helps you to better understand people in general. And I think in large part, that's a great part of what the problem is. White folks, and I'm not saying this negatively, I'm just using the word as lack of knowledge, are ignorant really to the true character and personality of Black people.
Mhm.
A lot of them have been indoctrinated by news and all types of negative press and mishaps rather than personal experiences. And let me ask you this, your personal experiences, is that what helps you determine your career path?
Yes, it did actually. You know, you know, something about me is I'm a widow. I was married to a Black man, is actually had uh um a fatal incident with the Metropolitan Police Department here in DC a
I'm
couple
sorry to
years
hear
ago.
that.
Thank you. And you know, we grew up as kids together. We've known each other since we were late teens. He had several contacts with the criminal justice system over the years. You know, some was little petty stuff that, you know, who knows if it would be as serious as it was then, as it would it be then now as it was then, you know, time and culture changes. But you know,
What year was that, if you don't mind me asking?
so like the late 90s, before some changes happened with the DC government, we used to have a local prison, which was the Lorton Prison Facility. Is a notorious prison.
Mhm.
You know, he's 19 years old, spent time at Lorton. You know, I mean, this is a serious incident in a young person's life to go to a place like Lorton with its reputation and lore and like all of the things that you heard on this, you know, the word on the curb was so crazy about the things that happened in Lorton. And this is a 19-year-old young guy that like went there and spent formative time there for months. So I learned a lot about the system, knowing him and being in closeness with him. And then he spent time at Cumberland facility in Western Maryland, which is a federal facility, because after a certain period, DC offenders went to the Bureau of Prison system because we didn't have Lorton anymore. It got closed because of its reputation and storied history there. So a lot of things that I learned about the system came from growing up and like growing into maturity around somebody that had this contact with the criminal justice system. And it did inform my career choices. I was a classroom teacher. I taught high school. And then one day I thought, you know,
In the DC area?
in the DC area. And then one day I said, you know, I want to be a public defender. I want to be a courtroom defender. I want to learn like how to protect people in the system. You know, I want to learn about it. I want to do that work.
So you were initially a teacher?
I was a classroom teacher, high school teacher in the public school system here, and then in Maryland too. And then, you know, I went to law school thinking I want to be a public defender. I want to do this work. And when you go to law school, it's a whole transition of life and you learn all these things. And, you know, you realize it's this career where you could go all kinds of different directions. But I stayed with the idea that I wanted to be a public defender. So I got into that community, and there's a lot of really talented people that do that work, and they're true believer people. They're system disruptors. You know, they are very surprising community of people. They have come from different places and spaces in this world. I mean, a lot of people from the military go into being public defenders, and you know, it's like you think these clean cut Marine like white guys with blonde hair, blue eyes, and they're like public defenders, and they're like awesome at the job.
In the trenches.
In the trenches, really good at it, like really good at it.
Is that a different breed, a public defender? Is that a different breed of lawyer?
I think so. I would say, and most people that have done that work, it's like it stays with you. You're a part of a religion. You believe in something different. You know about things that others don't know. You've held people's hands in the darkest of times. You've had great try. When you win as a public defender, you really win.
Well, the word on the street is that the public defender works for the judge's office.
That's the word. But it's
is that true? Tell
no, I say it's an unfortunate association. Some of us work differently than others, but I would say that when I worked with folks that would almost laugh that off and be like, I'm the best lawyer money can't buy. You know, like I'm your real fighter. And I work with folks in the public defender system in many places. And I mean, these are all people that would just like blow your mind, brilliant, dedicated, doing the work, and making it happen on the ground level. And so I learned a lot from those experiences, and that's why I went to law school. That's how I developed sort of this vision of what I wanted to like do with my career. And then you reach places where you think you can do different stuff, which is how I ended up doing like prison litigation and other stuff where you want to fight the system from a different angle because you just want to try something new. Things get old.
And you fought for housing for low income tenants?
Yeah, I did that in law school. I taught law school in DC, and there was a clinic that I was working with a woman who kind of like me had done government work, and we were kind of disillusioned, but we wanted to work with students, so we did this landlord tenant work. Almost like we wanted to build a legal aid office, and so we were trying something new. We were jointly trying something new with our careers, so it was different but similar, I say.
Mhm.
I think you had a question about like what kind of clients we had and how.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because I know, by me have been in a little bit of trouble. And I'm actually a victim of what we're talking about, this sentencing guidelines business. But I forgot what I was going to say. It'll come back to me. But I will say that one of the reasons that I find this so near and dear to my heart right at this moment is because I've just, and I read some of your profile, I spent in the 80s, from 82 to 89, 88, 82 to 88, 81 to 88, I'm sorry. I spent in the Alabama prison system.
Wow.
And from 21 or 22 to 29 years old. And what I did was here recently, I applied for a pardon.
Okay.
I sent the paperwork in and so forth and had the people, and all of that. So I've actually was given 2 20-year sentences for some crimes that one of them was robbing I was young, he was young, a drug dealer, but he happened to be white and suburban.
Okay.
And reported that I took his money and didn't report the fact that it was a drug deal. So I got 40 years, but they, made him concurrent into one.
Okay.
That was a severe crime for a person that didn't really have any criminal record.
Right.
So that's what makes me an advocate for this in the first place, is because I, like you, have similar experiences just on the other side of the fence, of why I would be concerned about something like this. Dr. King, he had said that based on one time I heard him say, based on the racial history of this country, Blacks were entitled to reparations. And I'm asking you, do you feel like the injustices that have been committed against Blacks in this country, do they deserve any type of reparations?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big proponent of reparations. I don't know exactly what it should look like because I think there are smarter people that can come up with better ideas than I can, but I'm a proponent of it in theory and in practice. A little bit of my bio is I've done some work with cannabis businesses and folks who want to get into the cannabis industry because they work.
I saw that. Tell us a little bit about that. I was going to ask you about that anyway.
So, a lot of people in DC, when our regulations changed a little bit and we went and decriminalization happened here in the city, but because of Congress and we're not a state, we don't really have a taxation system where it's adult use the way like California, Colorado, and all these other places are doing nowadays. It takes forever to get laws passed in DC, like it seems, because it's Congress, right? And anyways, there are a lot of entrepreneurs in the space that, are kind of trying to legitimize their, what I call a standard market operator business. People call it the legacy market. Basically, if you worked in the black market, as they say, and you want to go into the green market, it's this transition. And folks are trying to kind of learn business acumen and legitimize their, a for-profit business that deals, basically being in the cannabis industry and knowing what we know about drug enforcement laws, the war on drugs as part and parcel of the conversation about sentencing laws and the draconian punishments and mandatory minimums and all that stuff that happened in the, decades ago. I've come to this place where there's a lot of talk about social equity in the industry as being sort of trying to right the wrongs of drug prosecutions and figure out a way to give priority to people of color who are punished or come from communities that were decimated by the war on drugs. The conversation's gotten a little complex, which is why I say there's smarter people out there that can figure out what does reparations really look like. In the instance of the cannabis industry, I'm of the mind that all licenses should go to folks who had gotten in trouble, you know, and prosecuted and punished for drug crimes in the past, or someone in their immediate family or someone relative who can economically prosper from being able to get licensing within the business, or just basically give a license to anybody, and not put a cap on it so that there's no limitations in the industry. So anybody, whether you're experienced or not experienced, or you're a legacy operator or whatever your history is, you can get a license. And that, to me,
that would be a qualifying factor that you had to have had a case where you were, are you saying like you were given a unfair sentence and
you were prosecuted at all for cannabis crime,
for a drug case,
for a drug
cannabis.
crime, right? And if you so desire to be licensed in the industry, to be a cultivator, a distributor, a retailer, whatever your interest is, that you get immediate priority for licensing.
What's your justification when you make that case? What's your justification for that?
So I think it's just, you know, if you think about marijuana prosecutions as sort of the gateway to a lot of other larger scale drug prosecutions, particularly in the federal court system. When you work in federal,
good point.
You know, the inequities are severe. And I talked a little bit about how juveniles get involved in the court system, and then that becomes this indelible marker on your record that becomes problematic later, even if you're not charged with a drug crime. That's usually for a cannabis related crime, at least in prior decades. And so that's a reason to also create a system where priority licensing goes to folks that had previously been charged.
Is that do you consider that a type of reparation?
I think it is a type of reparations. I don't think it's I don't think it's the whole kit and caboodle.
No, I'm talking about just for the people that have been convicted of cannabis charges.
I think it's a start. I'll say that. I don't think it's everything that everybody wants, you know, and that's why I don't want it to. I think the conversation about reparations should never be limited. I think in some respects, you know, we could be having a larger conversation about land ownership, and other things, particularly as it relates to the American South. You know, I think the sharecropping system that emerged after slavery is something to be examined and to look at in terms of you know, sort of the robbery of land that happened.
I never got my 40 acres and a mule, by the way. My people, they never got it.
Right. And I mean, that's where the conversation really started. And there was activity to award reparations post-slavery, but it quickly, you know, kind of got extinguished by white supremacists and other actors that infiltrated government right away in order to kind of preserve the Confederacy, right? You know, so there's a lot of interesting things that can be done. And like I said, I think there's smarter people out there that can be like devising the measures by which we offer reparations. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates, like he testified in front of Congress about ways we could do it a couple years back. And that was, you know, hopefully we thought that was going to be the start of a discussion about it. But as lots of things happen, they kind of go the wayside, and then we don't know what Congress is going to do. But I think there's lots of ways that we could create reparations. You know, we've done it in the past. We've offered reparations to Japanese victims of Japanese internment camps in World War II.
Sure.
You know, when you get a settlement against a police department for brutality or instances of brutality,
that's reparations.
You get settlements. I mean, we see it in the court systems. We've done it in certain ways as a society. It just hasn't been done large scale. And, you know, there are a lot of great minds out there that can participate in the conversation. I think Henry Louis Gates had an interesting way of evaluating like your lineage in order to establish that you're a descendant of slavery. And then what's the economic impact of it on your family is like, you know, a forensic accountant can kind of add to the conversation. There's lots of ways to do it. And I know there's lots of, like I said, smart people out there talking about it. And, you know, I'm a proponent of it. Whatever I can offer to the conversation, however scant, I'm willing to do it. But
sure.
You know, when it comes to the criminal justice system, there's definitely data we can mine. How many people were prosecuted? When were they prosecuted? And for what crime? And if it relates to a drug crime, I think there's ways to establish that those were, you know, first of all, we're talking about a substance that's no longer even on the state level even controlled anymore. And that's why cannabis is a good place to start. We've essentially legalized something that was criminalized for so long, and it's, for lack of a better way, it's a black and white area to really start the conversation. It was prohibited. Now it isn't. And we can look at what we did in the past, identify the victims of it, and find a way to recompense by allowing entry into an industry where they might be able to have economic success. It's kind of like a pot has a lid, you know. It fits the narrative.
Is there a market for that?
There's
I
a
mean,
lot of it, you know, when states legalize, you know, adult use you know, when it goes to the ballot and the voters voted in, like New York was the most recent one to do it. The voters and the legislators demand that there are social equity provisions in the in the regulations. The problem is, to your question about, you know, sort of who's in power and who are the decision makers, we don't always have a clear-cut view of who's going to, you know, rubber stamp the corporate responsibility that we have to work into the regulations.
No, I meant specifically when you advocating for the fellows that were given these sentences that were cannabis related, if they wanted to break off into the business and become legal in that way because of that injustice, well, even if it wasn't injustice, because of that conviction, I'm saying, is there a market for that? Is there enough people that are interested in doing that have committed those kind of crimes or been convicted of those kind of crimes?
Oh yeah, for example, in New York, like the first round of conditional licensing afforded to cultivators and retailers in the New York State program, the first 200 were given to justice-involved people or had prior records. The applications were in the 200,000s. So we're talking about, I mean, if you
so there's a huge market.
There's a huge market, right? So there's lots of people that didn't get what they were applying for. So that to me is why I think that, you know, we can't have limits on this kind of stuff. You can't just have 200 licenses, but there's a huge market and interest for it.
You know what? And that when I read that about you, I didn't even realize that, and I know more about it than I did in the reading, but I didn't realize that, there is this kind of market. I thought this was such a big process itself to get involved in this. A lot of people, and I think that's what a lot of people think, they just don't do it because they think that it's too much bureaucracy. But what you're saying is it's just a matter of an application and to qualify.
Yeah, but even that suggests complexities there, right? You know, like a lot of folks are, you know, turned off by some of the administrative steps, the hurdles. And when you think about how the illegal market used to run, you know, it wasn't quite as complicated. And some folks are turned off by working with the government and don't want to go to, you know, state agencies and start getting paperwork done. They want to just do things the way they've always done it. There's some pluses and minuses to that, as there are with everything, but there is a interest, and some people want to go the distance and others just kind of want it to be simpler.
I see. Well, I've been thoroughly educated. You're a brilliant.
Oh, well, that's very nice. That's very nice.
You have a sharp mind, and I don't mean just from a judicial or law standpoint. I just mean period. You're very impassioned, and you seem to directly know what direction you want to go in life, and that's a big plus. And I want to applaud you for advocating on the behalf of African Americans, because we're not so bad. And if people would just, like Rodney King said, God bless his soul, if we could just all get along, that's not going to happen unless people acknowledge the wrongs that have been done in this country. It's okay. Everybody commits wrongs, but the racial wrongs that have been, you know, that have been committed against Blacks, I think people that perpetrate these incidents, regardless of whether they were Black, white, or whatever, that there needs to be an acknowledgement of that and accountability. And then we can actually move forward, because we would be in unison and be on mutual ground. And that would help propel us. From your platform, this is my last question, because I know I've held you up for a minute, is I know you believe that. What are you doing, or what could you suggest for someone else to do, for me to do, or for someone else? If you were an advocate, we're talking about these disparities in the sentencing among Blacks, what can Black people as a whole do to help the situation?
So I think, you know, there's lots of things that one could do, but some of them are more difficult and complicated than others. But I think the number one thing that folks can do is be involved locally with respect to your local leaders, and know, you know, kind of it's knowledge is power, right? And the idea that you want to know, just for awareness purposes, how are your local judges, how are, what's the how are they elected, when are they up for election, local states attorneys, district attorneys, folks who are in positions of prosecutorial power and that sit on the bench and preside over criminal cases. Who are they? How are they elected? When are they up for re-election? Do you like them? Do you dislike them? How do you have a feeling one way or another? Get people aware and active with respect to who are your local leaders in quotation marks. Those particular leaders are critical to criminal justice reform. They say there's 52 criminal justice systems. There's actually like 4,000 something of them if you think about cities and states across the US. And your locally elected district attorneys, states attorneys, county attorneys, sheriffs, police commissioners, those are people that make decisions that are going to impact the broadest swaths of our communities. Like, it's not just these national elections and things like that have the most importance in your life. It's the local leaders, local law enforcement. And if you're not someone, I'm not like a proselytizing, like go to the polls person. I do what you feel is important for active, being a part of your community. But my main thing is like, know who they are. Just know who they are. Because at some point down the line, you want to be a resource to somebody else, because you're going to get a phone call. I get them all the time because I'm a lawyer. Hey, I got this legal problem. Can you help me out? But the idea here is that like, you want to be a resource to your community. So you hear that the neighbor across the street, her son got locked up, like be a resource for her, try to help answer questions. What can you do to be helpful?
Because you're educated.
Because you are, everybody can, each one teach one is kind of like the idea here, which is, it's scary to be involved in the criminal justice system. Most people are embarrassed by it. It's like it's a mark of shame. You don't want to talk about it. You get isolated. It gets depressing. It hurts your family. You've got lots of people at home that are devastated by losing a loved one to the criminal justice system. It's lonely. It hurts. And the idea that we have community out there and people who really are actually interested and want to know what you're going through, what it feels like, is important. It makes a difference. It changes the tone. And I think that's number one thing that people can do, is just know what your criminal justice system looks like, know who the players are. If you want to get involved in their election or not election or re-election or somebody new in the role, that's one thing. But knowing who they are and knowing what the system looks like and feels like is something you can do for the person next door, because it's going to happen. It's just going to happen. And in order for people to feel less alone and less afraid, it makes a difference that there's somebody in the community that they can talk to just to listen, because it happens every day all over the place in every block of America. And it's just, we don't talk about it. And in order to normalize it and make people feel better and safer and just a little bit more seen, I think it just is about being aware and being that person that's not afraid to ask the questions, and also somebody that, is approachable, that you can be asked a question of, like, come over and talk to me about what you're going through. Because it makes a huge difference in people's lives in order to feel like there's somebody out there they can speak to about what they're going through, because it is very upsetting and heavy and intense, not only for the person going through the system, of course, as you know, but for the community, in order to like normalize and give support and spread the love, so to speak. Being educated in that regard goes a long way.
I actually asked someone else here not long ago that question, and they actually essentially, not word for word, said the same thing you're saying: become involved in your local community. Okay, so you become involved in your local community and you advocate for this. I mean, this means get out, and we have to do some work, though. This means you have to get out and talk to people, whether it's one-on-one or have a forum at the library or however you want to do it. But so those that are educated, so they should get educated about who the prosecutors are, who all these elected officials are, because if you learn something about them, then you can make and I'm asking you, is this what you were saying? Then you can make in layman's terms, and then you can make an educated decision if you become involved, and then you can vote that decision. And ultimately, we would hope that will make some type of change in your community. as a whole. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's the knowledge is power aspect of it. Whether you want to go to the polls and do something kind of direct is one thing, but creating community conversation around who the people in power and the, you know, folks are, makes people, you know, it gives the tools out there for people to do what they feel is necessary and be empowered. You know, it's like, if you want to be the person that goes to the polls, okay, but if you want to be the person that just provides the sounding board to talk about it, that's also got a value too. And you're playing a role, and you're giving strength to the community, as opposed to keeping everybody siloed and separated and not knowing what each other is going through.
And then just lastly, and then our local government, because we're going to educate people here, our local government, how does that trickle up to the larger government? How does that work? Just simply put, how, so people can say, well, you know, our local people, regardless to who we vote in, they're not going to really do anything, because I think people don't know how that process works. Quickly, how does that work when you're voting in large part for you and for good people in your local community? How or can that trickle up to the larger politicians, so that you can actually get some national resolution? How does that work, that process?
So I was just think of, actually, as you spoke, I was thinking of, you know, what I learned in Alabama litigating against KIV and the Department of Corrections in Alabama, which is a lot of local level sheriffs and law enforcement are starting to hear the community out on the overpopulation in the prison system. And the Alabama prison system, notoriously known as one of the most dangerous systems in the world, the most oppressive systems in the world. And because of the litigation against the prisons and how they're building these new prisons, and no one wants to work for them because they don't pay very well, and it's a horrible, horrific job, and it's just a terrible economic setup, the local sheriffs and law enforcement are declining to prosecute and lock people up because they don't want to contribute to the problem. And when you have local police officers that don't want to pull people over for DUIs, don't want to charge for these low-level crimes in court because they know they're just doing nothing but making the community members even worse off, because they have to work under even worse conditions. If you keep overpopulating these prisons, you're going to have even worse working conditions for these people that their only economic choice is to work for some of these prisons in Alabama because they're so isolated. That then gets translated to the Department of Corrections. They can't hire people. They have a total hiring fiasco. And then folks like KIV and the senators who represent Alabama are basically like, we have a law enforcement crisis in our state, because we can't get we can't get our street officers to lock people up, because they know that that's going to affect their next door neighbor who has to work at the prison where this person is going to end up. And so it's this revolt that's happening on the ground level that then gets transmuted to KIV and others who are in a higher up, and it changes the tone. And then the judges start seeing what's going on, and then, you know, then it forces the state senators or the US senators who represent the state to go to Congress and basically be like, I got a total crisis in my jurisdiction. I can't even contribute to the other conversations about this, that, and the other thing, because I got this massive crisis in my community. So that's like an example from Alabama that's actually happening. Now, for it to really be a change maker, I think it has to be, the volume has to be turned up like times 1,000, and it has to get 10,000 times worse in order for it to get better. But that's kind of the way it works. You know, but that is happening. I saw that when I worked, you know, with the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is the judges started suggesting that, like, they'd be like, Ms. Mize, what do you want me to do? And I'm like, just release the prisoners. Isn't that what the community wants? Let them out, you know, because they don't want to send them there. They don't, the police officers and the sheriff's department, the deputies don't want to send people to prison because it's literally harming their next door neighbor.
Yeah, and not just that, it's totally unnecessary. You know, I know firsthand that there's a great many people that are in prison doing time, whether it's 2, 3, whatever years, that really don't deserve to be in prison for what they've done. You know what I mean? So I guess that ripple effect everybody's feeling, and now even in the communities of those that are holding these people hostage. So that's good. That means that we are making some progress, and hopefully this Alabama thing, I think I've heard some tell of they're considering that actually here in Georgia. So maybe this is having a ripple effect, and, you know, can do a good national service, and we can make some change here, because there certainly needs to be some.
Sure.
Ms. Mize, thank you.
You're absolutely welcome. I had a great time, and anything you any other future topics that you think of for your production. I'm happy to be a part of it.
Absolutely. I'll probably have a panel on something that'll be judicious, and if it's in your category, I'll certainly invite you.
Okay.
Again, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. You have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.